I know you'll think this is crazy, but all I want to do is hold you. And I think that if you let me do that just for a few seconds, I can walk away and never speak to you again.
It's very difficult in the publishing world today for any book with literary aspirations to become well received and widely read. And so I've been very much surprised to see the reaction to this book.
It's a brilliant novel.
I felt that the book was very finely worked and densely textured.
When I first read Snow Falling on Cedars, I was really struck by how it was so filled with complexity and emotion and drama.
Stay away from white boys. Marry one of your own kind.
This is a book that managed to capture a love story first.
She's married, Ishmael.
And it's set against a very dramatic piece of American history.
You have to let go. That's the way things are.
I loved it when I read it. It has all these elements to it.
Carl Heine is dead. It's all over the island.
You've been arrested.
Well, you have no answer. You sit there in silence.
This trial is wrong. The whole thing is unfair.
I know that the novel was a great success in this country. I know also that in my country, in Sweden, it was a great success.
It takes a rare thing, a turning point, to free oneself from any obsession, be it prejudice or hate or even love.
I hope that the film will deliver the same kind of emotional depth and satisfaction that people obtained from reading the novel.
Snow Falling on Cedars grew out of a sense of place, the community in which I live. I live on a small island in Puget Sound that is in many ways like the island in the book. And the history of our island is similar to the history of the island in the book. The structure on which the story is hung is that of a trial which occurs in the early 1950s on a small island in Puget Sound. A Japanese-American gill netter, a salmon fisherman named Kazuo Miyamoto, has been charged with the murder of a German-American gill netter named Carl Heine, who's been found drowned in his net. And this trial unfolds during a rare snowstorm that's inundating the island. The owner, editor, and sole proprietor of the local newspaper, a man named Ishmael Chambers, is covering the trial with a professional interest, but also with a personal interest, because years before, prior to World War II, he had been engaged in a clandestine love affair with the accused man's wife.
Hatsu, are you all right?
Go away, Ishmael.
The research that I did for Snow Falling on Cedars was substantial and varied. Part of it was the sort of natural research that occurs when you live in a place and you gradually get to know its culture, its economy, its history, and so on. As I wrote the book, it became necessary to engage in more particular research. For example, I was provided with about 600 pages of transcribed oral histories by the Japanese American Community Association of Bainbridge Islands, as well as conducting my own interviews. One exercise I really stayed away from in the course of writing the book was imagining it as a film. I think that's counterproductive to writing a novel. I think you need to concentrate on what you're doing and let other people down the road do that sort of work of imagining it as a film.
This was a very difficult novel to adapt because it's operating more on a literary structure. It's nonlinear, and that's often a difficult way to tell a story within the convention of a movie script.
You know, I said to David, I'm gonna, in my draft, make the story my own, and there will be differences. I promised that I would show him the draft when it was over and that we could talk if he wanted to. It's not usually done. And we did talk about it afterwards, and he had many of his thoughts and feelings, and a lot of things that David wanted to see in the film actually got into the film because of how articulately and passionately he was able to express his views. I really did no historical research. For me, there is so much more material in that novel than I would ever be able to use. The research that you do when you adapt, or that I do when I adapt, is internal, emotional research. When you're writing the character, Hatsuha can't be David's Hatsuha. It's got to be the Hatsuha that comes out of you.
They're no better than animals.
Not all of them.
How would you know?
Because I live here, among them. So do you.
Speak with great assurance, Hatsu. The words fly from your mouth.
I don't care what you say. Do you hear me? I don't want to be Japanese!
One of the things that's really interesting about how this piece evolved into a film is sort of three visions of what this story would be. It is quite a blend of the way David saw it, the way I saw it, and the way Scott came to see it. I think for Scott, it's much more clearly a dominant love story than it had been before.
And then she hugs, and then she leaves, but we just stay on him.
And difficult to bring off, and I think he just did, to my mind, a masterful job.
Cut, thank you. I came across the novel when I was making a documentary in America, and I read it on the plane home, and I felt it was the kind of book that I would love to adapt into a film. This was before Shine had been released, but after the film had had some success, and I was asked what sort of material I wanted to work with, I said, well, Snow Falling on Cedars is the kind of book that I really like. And so the process really started from there.
You could do something to help.
Is that what you think? Well, maybe I should write an article. Yes, about unfairness. About all the unfair things people do to each other.
How do you take 600 pages, and make them into 2 hours of entertainment? It's a challenge, but David Goodison was extremely helpful in advising me, and he was a resource for me for the authenticity of the characters and situations.
Nothing you can say in the screenplay can contribute a fraction to the contribution that Richardson and Scott have together when they really say what image can replace what words. It's not only striking and beautiful and dramatic and brilliant, but it also is telling the story.
Bob Richardson, as director of photography, and I just found that we established very quickly a rapport and a kind of language of images which we both shared.
He spent a great deal of time with Scott early on to define the look and the style of the movie.
The issues that we discussed at that point were Scott's reservations, number one, with making this look like a period film. Despite the fact that it's sitting in the middle of a very specific time period, and we still have a great deal of respect for the period, but at the same time we tried to treat it in something of a more casual way.
And cut! Cut, cut, cut!
We also talked about visual elements, how to approach a story.
I really admire the fact that Scott rose to the challenge of trying to tell this story in a non-conventional way, and in a way that I think will be extremely emotional and very dramatic, because although it's full of flashbacks, which is certainly nothing new to the convention of movie making, the way in which these flashbacks work is that they're really more memories, in some cases dreamlike, surreal in nature. They're photographed in a very abstract way, and they take you back to the emotional peak that each of these events occurred.
That sequence moves between the war. Ethan Hawke is washed up on a beach and slides up as he starts to regain consciousness to reveal in the background 2 severely out-of-focus bodies. And those 2 are revealed to be the young Ethan Hawke and the young Hatsu. At first, I was skeptical that the sequence could function, but in the process of shooting and rehearsing, it became very apparent that Scott was absolutely right, and it worked extremely well.
So there are a lot of logistical problems that were created by the book because it wasn't a real place and it was in David's mind. But the interesting thing, I think, is that he based it on real occurrences and real historical fact. And so then we were able to go back into the research to find what places really look like that he might have made up in his mind, and then create those places in locations that would work for the movie.
That's the Vegeta girl, isn't it?
No, that's Hatsu Amada.
Oh, yes, she's lovely.
I think one of the important things that comes out of this story is a period of history that seems to have been forgotten and kind of swept under the rug. And this was the period of history right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, where I think the entire populace kind of panicked and went into this total overreaction about a possible Japanese invasion onto the mainland.
The FBI is in Seattle right now arresting Jap traitors, spies and everything.
And so through a government edict, all of the Japanese American citizens were interned into these camps that were set up in several different places here in the West and held for quite a long time. They were American citizens, some of them were fighting in the war, but they were still interned in these camps, and it was really, I think, a dark period in our history.
When I went to visit David Goodison on Bainbridge Island, he took me and introduced me to a number of people who had actually been through that experience themselves.
I was in the original group that was rounded up by the U.S. Army and interned, and I was 2 years, 9 months at that time.
So when we came to film the events, we invited those people to join us and be a part of reliving the experience they had had 50 or more years ago.
Well, I'm the baby in the picture. This is my mother. She cried this morning when they first started out. I don't know whether it brought back some bad memories or sad memories, obviously.
It was a very, very moving element and very powerful to me as a filmmaker to have those sort of touchstones with reality, if you like, into the events that had actually inspired the novel and the film.
And I remember very clearly as a kid the atmosphere of prejudice against the Japanese, which was odd to me. You know, as a kid, I think prejudice is always odd, but it struck me as particularly strange. I mean, I remember my mom and dad talking about it, and still with this kind of dismay that it could have ever happened.
Did you see the letters?
Seems like you're favoring the Japs, Art. The newspaper's an insult to all white Americans. Please cancel my subscription.
What are you gonna do?
Send him a refund.
You can't, as a filmmaker, decide that you are going to teach people a history lesson. That's going to come from the strength of the story that you tell. So I wouldn't like people to think that it's just about the evacuation of the Japanese.
I want you to marry me.
It's about what happened to this boy and this girl who had this innocent love. She is a Japanese American, he is an American boy, and the war that shatters that and separates them. That's the emotional core of the story.
This is the point where I never can come back to Ishmael. Even when I remember that moment, it just makes me, you know, so sad. So, I think it's going to be a really powerful moment.
I knew we could never be right together. And that soon I would have to tell you so. I'm going to move on with my life as best I can. And I hope that you will too. I must say goodbye to you.
70% of the job is in the casting, and I was very, very fortunate in being able to put together a tremendously powerful ensemble cast from international cinema, ranging from Ethan Hawke as one of the young generation of American actors.
It's rare that you read something where all the characters in a piece are kind of fully constructed. I mean, everybody has a past and a future.
Look, it's awfully cold in here. Let's talk in the kitchen.
I don't want to talk about anything.
You're just like your father. He never
I'm not just like my father. I know that everyone wishes I was. Whenever they look at me, I can hear them thinking, oh, he's only half the man his father was.
I was fully going to say he never minded the cold.
Then you have Sam Shepard, who is a legend of his own as a writer and an actor. Yuki Kudo from Japan, Rick Yoon, and James Cromwell.
This is a kind of film of which not a whole lot are made that informs an audience and alters their view.
This court takes judicial notice of the fact that tomorrow is the 9th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which has no relationship whatsoever to this trial. Which is why I mention it.
I think the most interesting thing about working with Scott is his experience in documentary. He's very good at all the little details that create an atmosphere of what it's like in real life.
He makes you feel very comfortable and is able to just translate and communicate exactly what he's looking for in an actor's language.
He always precise with his thinking, and he always gives me specific idea what my character thinks and feels.
It was a very difficult role to cast, the role of Hatsu, but Yuki has a unique sensibility, if you like. She places herself within the emotions of the character so accurately and so profoundly. It's quite remarkable to watch.
So apart from your concern about a land deal evaporating, what was your reaction to the news that a husband and father to small children was dead with his skull bashed in?
If you mean to imply that we didn't care about Carl's death, that is wrong and insulting.
Then you have Max von Sydow, the giant of European and world cinema, whose performances I'd grown up on and in fact were part of the inspiration to me to become a filmmaker. So it was tremendous to have someone like that on my set and be working with him.
Nils Gudmundsson is an old lawyer, and he's a good man, a very righteous man. And I felt that I understood Nils quite well from the beginning. I sympathized with him, and it was a pleasure to play him.
You might think that this is a small trial in a small place. Well, it isn't. Every once in a while, somewhere in the world, humanity goes on trial.
With this powerful cast and the love story between Ethan Hawke's character and Yuki Kudo's character, it was a director's delight to have these people to work with. In the film, the weather is a character as well. Our difficulty was recreating this very unusual event which David Goodison describes in the book, which is a great blizzard by the sea.
Morning, Horace. Reminds you of 1930, doesn't it?
1929, Nels. I believe you're thinking of 1929.
The snow itself is falling steadily on the township outside the courthouse windows. Inside the court is like a pressure cooker or a greenhouse, if you like, where the heat is turned up and people are dressed against the cold and they're almost sweating with some of the pressure and tension and the heat that's generated in that room.
Didn't you just tell us that you
But
found
the strange thing is, it's got
on the deceased?
Objection! The witness is speculating.
Art, no, ask you to explain it.
The central issue is the symbol of snow. And that metaphor is how snow tends to blanket and hide the past.
So when an inanimate object like the weather becomes a character in the story, that puts more of a burden on the production to make it right.
We knew going into this movie that we were going to be facing the challenges of the weather, and in many ways I think that it worked to our benefit. I think first of all, there's an energy and a momentum that comes when you know that there are things you're going to be dealing with that are out of your control. So to me, you use that in a positive way creatively.
I've been tremendously fortunate to work with a great group of creative people, with Kathy Kennedy and Frank Marshall as producers, who've helped me put together a team with people like Janine Opperwald as designer and James Newton Howard, who brought such a huge contribution to the film.
Scott is very much a director where music plays a big, big part in anything he's doing visually.
Scott really trusted the film and allowed the film to unfold at its own pace. So that was a real opportunity where I thought the visuals and the music really came together. The music was designed in many cases to act as a sound effect, so it had a sort of airy quality to it, so it worked quite well with wind, and it had a kind of blurry quality to it, so it worked quite well with sort of muted sounds, and it just kind of all became one. I just think it's a magnificent film. I mean, I'm just proud to have been associated with it.
Every single scene in this movie is a visual feast.
The cinematography of Bob Richardson, the direction of Scott Hicks, the music of James Newton Howard, the editing of Hank Corwin, all of these elements come together to make this grand piece of work.
It's a story with many different layers to it.
It has all these elements of forgiveness and compassion and understanding.
You see the real history, and also you see real human dramas.
It is a poetic film which deals with real people.
It's unlike almost anything I've ever seen.